How can you make a sustainable policy? Of course, by filling the gap, closing the gap between, on the one hand, policy making, and on the other hand, the evidence and the research that is out there. The main priority of the EU and its member states are currently preventing irregular migration, on the other hand, returning people who are not authorized.
Return migration is not only an administrative process, it is a complex process of political negotiations between the EU and its partner states. Both sides expect recognition for their return migration policy goals, such as the planning and predictability of readmissions, support with reintegration, or visa facilitation for their citizens. However, there is an imbalance between the interests of larger blocs such as the EU and smaller countries and their power to enforce their own interests. EU countries in particular face political pressure to justify current migration policies, and countries of origin do not always have the financial resources or security situation required to actually process returnees.
European governments tend to focus very heavily on speed, on documentation, on visible enforcement, and on statistical verification. Origin states, by contrast, need to evaluate different aspects: the absorptive capacity of the labor markets, the importance of remittances, the political sensitivities around mass returns of specific groups of individuals, or, most notably perhaps, the fiscal implications of reintegration.
This whole tough language and on conditionality and putting those governments really under big pressure creates a lot of resistance in those societies, because they feel, they perceive it as a kind of colonial attitude that comes from the EU and the member states.
So we live in a time when administrative systems are overstretched, and thus visible gestures become a practical substitute for deeper structural work. I use the term credible fictions because I aim to capture the way through which governments are able to signal responsibility in order to appear convincing to international partners.
There are three common types of credible fictions. Manipulation of numbers. Origin or transit countries often tend to argue that they are preventing millions of migrants from leaving the country or accepting large numbers of returnees. In return, they hope to receive massive financial support from the EU.
So in Lebanon, as well as in Jordan, Egypt, and elsewhere, officials have repeatedly presented very high estimates of the number of asylum seekers and migrants in this country, even when detailed UNHCR data reveals lower figures.
Performative enforcement of actions. This can include increased border controls or selective deportations, for example. These visible actions demonstrate states' willingness to act. They are most often emphasized in order to prove public accountability. State compliance. When origin states and the EU sign return and readmission agreements, they appear to adhere to international norms, even though safeguarding human rights principles on the ground is often ignored or not adequately fulfilled.
We need to keep in mind how governments consider public opinion, labor market pressures, internal security, as well as the political and social risks of reintegrating people that might be viewed as vulnerable, marginalized, or potentially destabilizing.
The EU is not listening anymore to those other interests, and you can see that very well, for instance, threatening with less development cooperation if the country of origin doesn't cooperate enough on returns. We give development cooperation not for migration reasons, but to make sure that that country, can develop itself better. And that would be a win-win situation, actually.
In other words, decentering becomes not just a normative stance in terms of what should happen or in terms of taking countries of origin's perspectives and limitations into account, but also a practical and strategic requirement for effective cooperation that is durable and long-term.